Hi. So in talking about all the things when it came to residency one, we talked about a lot of sensitive issues and really all of the issues from dangerousness, which would include suicide and homicide, sexuality, violence, and finances are all um, serious topics and important topics to discuss, especially when it is the initial or intake session. So, um, the first question is please consider how I might respond or share information about at least three of the um, sensitive topics that were given. And so I chose um, really sexuality, finances, and suicide or homicide. Um, and so going into it um, and trying to provide examples, I can use my life experiences with each one of these. Um, Actually, recently, and when I say recently, I mean by like Friday, I had a parent who called me um, who, you know, was calling to give me her new number. And in the midst of her giving me her new number, she asked me, or no, she just decided to tell me, oh, I'm ready to end it. She just started crying hysterically. And she lived about 30, 35 minutes away from where I live. So I got my car and I drove because I am a parent aide. And I met her and I kept checking on her while I also was texting my team lead and telling him what was going on. But anyway, in getting there and talking to her, I really didn't have to say too much. Um, I did ask, has she felt this way before? As far as like committing suicide, I asked her um, if she had a plan. I asked her if she um, have has had these thoughts, and she mentioned to me that no, only I guess when it got really hard for her, she decided she wanted to commit suicide. Um, but, never acted on it, never came up with a plan, never had an idea of like how she would handle it. So that let me know that, it was serious, but it wasn't, I guess, she hadn't gotten any further in her plans. So if that was my initial or intake session, I definitely would ask those questions. Did she have a plan? What would her plan be? Has she ever felt this way? What stressful situations have made her get to this? And that would also allow me to know if I am comfortable actually working with that client. I found out going through residency one that suicide and homicide, working with those types of clients was not my strong suit. and, that's something I definitely have to work on. So in this case, well, excuse me, hostile suicide or homicide clients were not my strong suit. So definitely paying attention to what are her triggers, how often she has these thoughts, things of that nature, I would always ask. When it came to sexuality, that is definitely important. Um, Especially, you don't want to assume that they are a he or she. So um, I would want to ask what do they identify with, what sexuality, if they're transitioning based off of their answers. Uh, what would they like to be called? Do they have another name? There was one guy that I went to high school with, and he no longer wanted to be called his birth name because he felt like that was an insult to who he felt like he truly was. And so there was one guy he wanted to be called Beyonce, and then there was another guy and he wanted to be called I forgot what name, but it was a female name, and that's who he identified with. So um, just to not be disrespectful and to try to help build that rapport, I definitely would ask, you know, what do they identify with? And then, you know, what are their struggles? Um, I have a sister who identifies technically as a homosexual female, but she more so identifies as a male. So when I've had a conversation with her in the past, she would tell me that it's okay to call her or she or her name, whatever. But as far as like what she wears, her um, demeanor, all of that was more towards the male perspective or male route, whatever you would think a male would do. Um, and so in doing that, when we talked about church and stuff like that, she felt there were certain words that she thought was offensive. Actually, one of the things was being welcomed. She did not feel welcomed, and that was surprising. Um, in seeing the perception my mom had versus what my sister felt and saw. So, definitely being mindful of the wording of my questions would be important, um, and not trying not to assume, and it's very hard not to assume. So, okay, then we got finances, and the finances, it's a very touchy subject. With my experience, I found it being more touchy with males than with females. Um, a lot of the parents I've worked with who are females, they are willing to share with me, their information because they want to get help or, to be better at it. So I definitely would ask questions of, what is their definition of stability. Um, I guess, what is their background based off of their intake, um, and that would also possibly have something to do with behaviors or their thought process or, other things that stem from finances that could also be a trigger, which can go back into dangerousness, which could, suicide and homicide. So definitely finances would be something I also would want to be careful in how I word um, the questions. I wouldn't want to, say that, oh, um, so you work hard, or would you say you're struggling? Like I wouldn't say that. I definitely would allow them to lead the question or answer. So into the next question. So if they want to say, "Oh yeah, I'm struggling," then it'd be like, oh, "Okay, so you are struggling," and you gotta use the reflections. Um, so yeah, I definitely would really more so go about um, what's their background like, what are their stressors, um, what do their finances look like if they feel like they're open enough to talk about it, or comfortable, excuse me, enough to talk about it. Um, and my comfort level with talking about sexuality and finances are pretty comfortable, um, just because I have experienced people on both ends where they felt offended because I assumed that they were of one type of sexuality, or they were offended because, um, I may not have uh, asked if they needed help, simple questions like that, or, handing out resources because I assume that they are okay. financially. So I think just being mindful of how I present these questions to them, um, and definitely do open ended questions. I would definitely, lead the question first, how are you financially, or, how, what's your family history or family background, and go from there and then ask them to tell me more about it and hopefully open the door for them to open up, when those very sensitive subjects. Let's see here. I think I covered the first two questions. Uh, okay, so the last question says finally consider the relationship between self care and clinical skill delivery, and does one exist? Um, Actually, that is a question I personally had. I wasn't sure um, if we can turn it off. I call it turn it off, turn it on. Um, but I know self care is very important. I think if you're comfortable enough with your self care and being able to combine it with your clinical skill delivery, then hey, I feel like that's a good thing. I'm gonna say it like that. Um, According to Hutchinson, um, it is definitely self care is important so that you can prevent burnouts. Um, I know this personally because I used to work at DFACS, and they stressed that we needed to, separate ourselves from work. Like that was all day, every day. You're working with so much time crunches, or you have so many time sensitive deadlines, and then you have all these people who are emotionally and mentally possibly unstable, and then you're trying to stay stable, and then you have to work with the children that may not or possibly be stable or mentally unstable. And so with all these things, if you bring this work home with you, you're not going to want to do the best job that you can do in that field. So I definitely, definitely, definitely see where self care is important, and it can burn you out so quick, and it can cause you to it can have an effect on your clinical skill deliveries. Um, let's see here on page 300. They were saying that counselors who deal with crisis on a regular basis are taxed in a variety of ways, much of it depending on the kinds of clients they serve. And they were focusing on crisis counselors and just the amount of energy and time and just effort it takes to work with those clients. And so, um, self care is definitely important. Um, Let me see here. Uh, mhm. Okay, and then also in Hutchinson's on page 301, it says some counselors have their own unfinished business, which adds to the difficulty. If a counselor has her own history of abuse and trauma, for example, she may be re-traumatized with every story of abuse and trauma that she hears. Um, I'm going to stop there because that example speaks for itself. You definitely want to step back, breathe, see a counselor, hang out, read, sleep, something to get away from it. And I think, yeah, self care, um, there is a relationship between the two, but it's a very thin line, I want to say, because I feel like if you enjoy doing clinical skills and counseling and all this stuff, and it doesn't bother you, um, I still would be careful. But I think self care is probably one of the most important. I know in residency one, the professors definitely kept telling us, to, take care of yourself. After you leave here, de stress, or, well, I'm going to interpret what they told me as to de stress and, just do what you need to do. But anyway, think I answered all the questions. I hope I did. And yeah, okay.